I'm very happy to be here, and I will try and address all of the things you suggest I will and I should talk about. But I would be very keen to also leave some time for questions because that, to me, will be the most interesting part of our conversation today. Let me maybe share a few slides that I have just to make it easier for us especially for me to keep to time. So I'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some questions to discuss the implications of some of the things that I raise here. Okay, so one of the things that I think was really useful um, generally for me as I started my research career was to spend time, and one of my initial projects actually, my PhD research when I started it, the MPhil research had been about labor unions in Pakistan, and I had wanted to understand how labor unions were organized in the contemporary context. Not so much a historical project, but much more a political theory, conceptual interrogation kind of project. But as I spent more time with the labor unions in Pakistan in the early 2000s, when I started my PhD in 2004, I realized that the unions that were still active and the unions that were still going were the ones that had a significant presence from the Jamaat-e-Islami in particular. There were various explanations for that. One explanation, of course, was that during the 1980s, when Pakistan was ruled by General Zia-ul-Haq, who was a military dictator, he had provided very explicit support for the Jamaat-e-Islami, partly also as a way to break the strength of leftist groups in labor unions, especially public sector industry, public sector companies and institutions. So there was a institutional reason, in a sense, for why Jamaat-e-Islami was present in those unions. But it still didn't explain why Jamaat-e-Islami had unions in the first instance. Because Abul Ala Maududi, the ideologue, the inspiration, the man who had set up the Jamaat-e-Islami along with some of his other friends and colleagues, was not convinced that the Jamaat should be a party that reaches out, that kind of structures itself in a way that deals primarily with the working classes. Maududi, as others have also documented, Maududi had set up the Jamaat-e-Islami as a vanguard party. He had something in mind, something similar to the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party of Russia. So he had set it up, he was not particularly, he wasn't against workers necessarily, but he wasn't particularly directly concerned with them. He had thought of this as a party of elite Muslims, educated Muslims, who can take over the state to transform society, to lead society towards a vision of justice that I will elaborate. That was his vision of justice. So the question for me then became how did the Jamaat change in this ways, and also what are the ways in which Maududi's ideas could be interpreted or reinterpreted by people who were now working either with working class people in labor unions or with peasants in Kisan unions. What had happened, what had gone on to make that shift? And as I understood or engaged more with Maududi's thought, I also realized that actually Maududi had been, Maududi has really, as Qasim Zaman says, really beginning to, some of the concepts that he put forward for us were really defining the common sense of most Muslim majority polities. And again, that is significant and under-recognized, especially in academic scholarship. Much of the scholarship from America and Britain, academic scholarship, tended to, through the 1990s into the 2000s, really until fairly recently, saw the Middle East and Arabic production as Islamic production, as the center of Islamic ideas. But I've argued elsewhere in my work as well, the not just the population centers, but also the centers of innovation, creativity, and rethinking within the Islamic world have really shifted eastwards. So they were South Asia for the last 2 centuries, and actually a lot more going on in Southeast Asia now. So these are, these are the places where a lot of the new ideas, a lot of the new organizational arrangements have come forward in the last century or so. And Maududi in that context has been very influential and somewhat under-recognized, precisely because academic scholarship has not, for instance, recognized how much influence he had on, say, the ideas of Hassan al-Banna, sorry, not Hassan al-Banna, but more Sayyid Qutb, and others, not just those who followed him, but also those who did not follow him, those who were competing against him or contesting his ideas. So all of this to say that I think that, I understand, Maududi is he's a complicated thinker. He's a thinker that many in Pakistan do not agree with. Similarly, many in Bangladesh find him a very difficult thinker to engage with because of the associations that we carry, not just with Jamaat-e-Islami, but also with Maududi. But I think it's very important, especially for us, if we disagree with somebody, if there are concerns that are raised, then it is very important that we engage with those ideas in some detail to think about what is it that inspires many. And certainly Maududi's thought inspired millions around the world. And so that bit is undeniable. But also, where is it? How far do we travel with him, right? How far do we accept or recognize the value of certain ideas that he raised? And also, maybe there are questions and areas that we disagree with. So how do we do this? The only way to do this is to engage seriously with his ideas, with the logic of his ideas before we start criticism. And one very productive idea, very generative idea that Maududi put forward was the idea of divine sovereignty. So I've argued in my work, in an article in the Review of Politics on his idea of divine sovereignty, that, this is an innovation. Sometimes people find that very difficult to accept because there is the idea that if this is an innovation, then, because there is the idea that innovations are not allowed in Islam, or innovations are somehow seen to be derogatory, that perhaps this is, it's not a good idea that this is an innovation. But in fact, Maududi was, I think the power of his ideas came from his ability to bridge different traditions, right? So he was clearly well-versed in Islamic history, certainly, the work of Quranic tafsir that he's written means that he's also well-versed in juridical debates. Philologically, he was quite, he had an expertise in Arabic literature. But he was also able to access and think through the European tradition as well. So he either read in translation, or he read excerpts, or he read in English. He did learn some English. There are reports that he tried to teach himself some German as well. It appears that may not have happened, but certainly there is an engagement with, particularly with English writing and English histories, English philosophy, that comes through in a lot of his work. So the concept of divine sovereignty, I suggest, is an innovation. It is true that there is a concept of the sovereignty of Allah in Islamic thought, and that is a long-running concept. It's not new. But the way Maududi articulated divine sovereignty is an innovation. So what is that innovation? I think to understand that, the first thing we need to do is to also just understand the difference between sovereignty, legitimacy, and authority. Sovereignty is complete control over something. Legitimacy may not come with complete control, but whatever control, whatever power you have, it is legitimate. It is considered to be lawful. And authority is the ability to make some change, or authority is the ability to exercise some power. Authority may or may not be lawful, it may or may not be legitimate, and authority may or may not be complete, like sovereignty is, right? So often we use these terms together, but they actually mean slightly different things. And Maududi articulated the concept, he kind of reinterpreted the concept of Hakimiyat Ilahiyya as divine sovereignty in political matters, in territorial political organization. Now, one of the ways in which we know that this was an innovation is that if we look at when he first starts using this term, he often also provides, because he often did that in his writing, he provides the English letter sovereignty in brackets, right? He actually explains, he feels the need to explain to his audience what is it that he is looking to say here, and what he's looking to say here is something that they already hear in the 1920s, 1930s, in urban colonial India, Delhi, where he's living. People would have also heard the term sovereignty. His educated audience that he's looking to engage with would have heard the term sovereignty, and he's actually, in a sense, saying, this is how I want you to think about Hakimiyat. Not Hakimiyat as God's ultimate authority and sovereignty over all our lives, but as a political project. We also see his attempt at really conceptual innovation and kind of thinking about new terms, new ways of thinking about political realities and solutions to those realities, by the fact that he coins a new term called theodemocracy, right? He says what he is proposing is not theocracy. That he says, and this is where he's one of the, he's really a proponent of moving political theory beyond Eurocentrism. He says what Europe is familiar with is theocracy, and that is the rule by a clerical class, by a class of religious leadership who also control the state. And to that extent, he is historically more accurate than many other commentators that we may have, because what happened in Europe was quite unique. So we know from the work of Talal Asad and others who have raised questions about how we understand the history of secularism and secularization in the European context. We know that something quite unique happened in Europe, which was not replicated easily in the Islamic world, in Africa, in Asia, which was that in Europe we have the development of a very hierarchical church, which also controls the state at the same time. We do not have something like the institution of the Inquisition, which is a long-running, at least 2 centuries, if not more, of inquisitions, which are actually interrogating people's consciousness. What are you thinking? What, you look like you're a Christian, you're acting like a Christian, but you haven't had pork in a week. Maybe you're not really fully a committed Christian. You might still be Muslim or still be Jewish, right? So we don't have the Inquisition, for instance, in the Islamic context. We don't have that also in the Hindu context. We don't have something like the structured Pope, one person who has authority over how religion is to be interpreted. in the Islamic context, certainly in the Sunni version, and also, also in many versions of what we broadly categorize as Hinduism. So we know that this was a unique process in Europe where religion and state came together, and Maududi is signaling that that is not our history. But he's saying we need to be careful about democracy, and he suggests something like a theodemocracy that I will talk about very briefly, very quickly. But here I just want to flag, and here I just want to raise the fact that Maududi would, this is a new concept, right? He's aware that this is a new concept. And so he's actively coining a new concept to explain a new project. Similarly, in another article, I have discussed his reworking of jizya. Maududi had a very profound critique of nationalism. Again, scholars, particularly scholars based in Western academia, have tended to, but also in South Asia, have tended to take his rejection of popular sovereignty that I will discuss shortly as a rejection of the will of the people, of democracy more generally, and they haven't looked at the detail of what he's doing in terms of his rejection of nationalism. For instance, Maududi was deeply concerned as a minority, as member of a minority community in what was then combined India, deeply concerned about the potential for a permanent minority in democracies. And this was a vibrant debate in the early 20th century. This was something that people were thinking about in the context of various Eastern European states. It was certainly a very live debate in India. And Maududi actually had a very profound critique of nationalism as an ideology that will actually hamper democracy. He's looking at the Nazis in Germany. He's looking at the treatment of African Americans in the USA. And he's saying there's something going on here where actually the state and nation come together. The ability to actually really oppress minorities is unprecedented. And so he proposes a new version of jizya. And again, that article has been published. It's in the Journal of Politics, so I won't go into those details here. But just to flag that Maududi had a lot of these kinds of innovations where he is actually much more thoughtful. So both for those who criticize him and those who follow him, when I suggest that he is making conceptual innovations to address what he sees as profound political problems, the idea of an innovation is a problem for both. And I'm suggesting that we need to kind of go past that to understand the depth of his thinking and the ways in which he constructed his arguments and the reasons why they were so attractive to so many. Okay, let me then go on to what exactly does divine sovereignty mean? It is obviously very useful to think about the particular intellectual and political context in which Maududi articulated this idea. This was a context which was not just, often when people talk about Maududi's ideas, and there's reams of really helpful, very useful scholarship on Maududi's thought, but in general, people have tended to place him either in conversation with other Muslims, as if he only spoke to Muslims, or in conversation with, a few big thinkers like Marx, etc. But in fact, Maududi was very consciously, very curious. He was, his innovation came from the fact that he was curious about other ideas, other traditions of thought, whether he he didn't travel outside, unlike many anti-colonial leaders of that time, like Nehru and Gandhi. He didn't travel much outside of South Asia, but living in India, he tried to access ideas across a broad spectrum. We know, for instance, that for some time he attended the meetings organized by the Khairi brothers, who were socialists. In Delhi, he absorbed ideas from a whole range of sources. And as I've mentioned before, he was bringing together different traditions of thought to think about what are the big contemporary political problems, and how can I find solutions for them from within the Islamic tradition, right? So that was largely his project. Now, one of the things that he identifies as a problem is the idea of popular sovereignty. Often when people see that first, headline news that he's against the idea of popular sovereignty, they stop there. We don't interrogate what was it that actually made it a problem for him. And I think he was quite prescient in noting that popular sovereignty, the idea that people will decide, and when they decide, that decision is final, or that decision can override other previous norms and laws. He was quite worried about this for two big reasons. One is that he thought that there was popular sovereignty really brought about a moral problem. If people thought of themselves as part of a majority, there was no moral limit to what they could do to the minority, because if it's the decision of the majority, if we are defining popular sovereignty as what the majority wants to do, then once the majority decides something, if that is the criteria, then that can become quite difficult to combat. And it may lead to situations where some people will be constantly minoritized. The other problem that he saw was that, and I think this is a stronger case for thinking much more critically about popular sovereignty. The other problem he thought was that, there is a way in which popular sovereignty ultimately, we say it's the will of all the people, but of course not all of the people can vote, not all of the people ultimately what they want is a different thing, so not what all of them want will be done. What can be done are some of the things that most of the people will want, and with that, ultimately what becomes much more powerful than before is the state. So even though we have the idea that it is actually the people making the decision, really what is getting strength and becoming more and having more and more legitimacy to its power is the state. So for Maududi, the concept of popular sovereignty brings with it these practical political problems. It is the problem of majority and permanent minorities. It is the problem of nationalism and its conflation with anti-colonialism, the idea that there is only one way to combat colonialism, and that is by imagining yourself to be a nation that needs to have a state. So a nation state, ultimately a nation state will make the nation by homogenizing language, homogenizing culture. And for those of us who have a shared history in terms of the idea of Pakistan, what was then West Pakistan tried to impose a language, a culture on East Pakistan, tried to homogenize in ways that was actually deeply problematic and led to the formation of what is today Bangladesh. So we know that we have seen some of this at play already, right? That the making of the nation can be the attempt to make a homogenized nation with the power of the state behind us can be a very brutal, very violent process. So in thinking about these issues, as I said, Maududi was drawing upon various international and non-Muslim interlocutors. So he looked, for instance, he was Gandhi was a kind of a foil for him, but also an inspiration for him. So Maududi rejected many of Gandhi's conclusions, but he actually retained some of the reasons. There's an overlap in the reasons that Gandhi raised or Gandhi articulated in terms of Gandhi's hesitation towards democracy, right? And Gandhi is also worried about the idea that the power that the state will have through the idea of popular sovereignty and democracy. And lest we forget, this is also a time when, even though there is a lot of debate and conversation around what democracy means, what popular sovereignty means, actually elites in this is, if he starts writing about this in the 1920s and 30s. There is very limited franchise in Europe and North America as well, or in America in particular. It's not limited by constitution, but it is limited in practice. African Americans can't yet easily vote, and they can't, sometimes, and Maududi raises this issue, they can't even get to the polling station. They'd be lynched before they get to the polling station. So there are these concerns about the kind of legitimacy. He's looking around the world. He's looking at various examples around the world. He's drawing upon the kinds of critique that Gandhi and others have also articulated. He's also drawing upon the critique that some elitist Europeans have also articulated about, people not being able to actually really fully recognize what is best for them, making laws that are actually contrary to their interests, etc. So he's bringing all of that in to say we need some kind of a moral limit to what the state can do and what people, when they are voting in a democratic setup, what they can do. And to him, divine sovereignty is a kind of a conceptual, it's a heuristic, it's a conceptual limit that can be placed on the state by saying, okay, humans can't make all the laws. Some laws have been set by God, and those laws or those kind of limits have to be followed. And within those limits, we can make various kinds of democratic decisions. He says, democracy is a very efficient process of, it's a very efficient system of making decisions within these boundaries. And to that extent, we can think of people like Carl Schmitt, who also had a critique of liberal democracy, parliamentary democracy, thinking about the kinds of limits that one can set. So Maududi, I think, if we place him within that kind of global intellectual context and debate, we see that he is looking at a problem that is of concern, not just to Muslims, not just in South Asia, but it's a wider concern. What he is doing is that he's emphasizing the aspect of moral bankruptcy that comes with popular sovereignty, and he's trying to provide a solution to that by really focusing on the divine kind of limits that one might impose in that situation. And in some ways, I think, in the article that I've actually put on slide here, just in case it's of interest for people, in some ways, it is also interesting to note that Maududi is actually, there is an interesting similarity between the colonial state and his ideal Islamic state, right? So the colonial state also has this project of civilizing the natives, of providing the kind of a moral direction to the natives. It's a state that is increasingly managing the population quite closely. And certainly for Maududi, even though he rejects the nation part of a nation state, he ultimately and paradoxically, despite his many kind of qualms about the reinforcement of state sovereignty under the guise of popular sovereignty, he has those qualms, but he nevertheless ends up taking the state more seriously and kind of relying on the state to transform society, to bring about those kinds of changes within that, because because he thinks once the state is contained by the concept of divine sovereignty, then maybe the state will not be as exploitative, not be as violent in its imposition. So I know that we have, as I said, I'm really very keen to hear what you have, the questions that might come up. So let me make a very quick jump from talking about the early 20th century and kind of moving over the last century very quickly, right? From we see that something happens, right? So Maududi is primarily thinking about, he's as I said, he's an innovative, creative, thoughtful person who has a particular framework within which he's trying to understand what are the big problems of the world today and trying to provide solutions for them. We can disagree with his analysis or his diagnosis of the problem. We can disagree with the solutions he presented. We can disagree with the process through which he came to those solutions. But we have to recognize that there was an integrity and there was a method through which he was really trying to work. So in many ways, he's a very systematic thinker. And we have to recognize, that many people did find it very attractive. And so that speaks, I think, to the depth of his ideas. There is always a gap between the ideas that people, that especially, influential thinkers articulate, and how their followers pick them up at later stages, and a gap between the ideas and historical experiences and how those ideas get shaped as we move forward. So Islamism, I mean, Maududi, of course, would not have recognized the term Islamism. He is talking about Islam. But what we today call Islamism, and when I use the term Islamism, I mean by it a strand of Islamic thinking and acting, or Islamic thought and practice that aims to take over the state, to transform society, right? It's very statist in its focus. It's paradoxical, given everything I have said so far about Maududi, that Islamism becomes so statist. And one of the things that is kind of beyond the remit of his ideas, but happens with the Jamaat-e-Islami through the 1960s, is again a global political context where the now imperial power of the world, which was the US, was much more interested in pushing back communist and socialist influences. And one of the allies that they had in that process, or one of the allies that they developed in that process, were various kind of Islamic organizations. But how did that happen? How was it possible? Because we also know that when Pakistan was formed, Jamaat-e-Islami and the Communist Party were actually the first ones to hold a joint jalsa, joint demonstration together against the Muslim League, given the kind of Muslim League's more autocratic decisions at that time. We know that Maududi was really inspired, and he says that again and again in his writings. He says, look at the communists. The communists do this. Why can't we even do this? The communists reject nationalism. Why can't we reject nationalism? The communists are able to, work with an ideology and die for that. Why can't we do that? So he's really inspired by the communists as well. But as we go through the 1940s and 50s, news about the which is amplified by Americans, of course, about atheism, about the persecution of Muslims and other religious minorities in the Soviet Union, is really becomes much more prevalent. But really, it's also a very local debate about, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, Malaysia, about who will control the state. So the leftists and the Jamaat-e-Islami or Islamist groups are both focused on taking over the state to transform society. And it is only from the 1960s onwards, really from the 1970s onwards, with the first Afghan war, when when America really started funding weapons for these parties, that something quite fundamental happened. And the shift in thinking about divine sovereignty, the relationship between state and religiosity, or the relationship between state and Sharia, is truncated in a way, in a very profound way. This is much beyond, I mean, Maududi had imagined this, but he had imagined a coming together of Sharia and the state, but he was still working through this. You know, you look at his speeches, you look at his writings from the 1960s into the 1970s. It's a really difficult problem for him to work through, because the more he does it, the more he realizes that Sharia is a very vast corpus, and to try and fit that, to make it compatible with the state, is a very complicated project. But when you have the next generation of Islamists coming in, they take away the complexity that Maududi is aware of and struggling with, and they make it much more simplistic, they make it much more violent, and we have a process there where there is a big kind of gap between those kinds of ideas. I think at the very least, it does show us, and recent debates as well do show us, that there has to be, again, for both the left and the right, whatever they mean today, for people who are interested in democratic, progressive politics, to really think about the relationship between secularism and democracy in a much more profound way. Because the idea that religious ideas, are by definition not democratic, not able to help us deepen or build a better democracy, etc., that is a problematic assertion. We know that historically, we see that in various ways, and we see that this kind of idea that democracy by itself is secular is also problematic. And elsewhere, I've looked at what is it that we value secularism for? We value secularism for the ability to promote tolerance in society. And if there are other ways through which we could actually promote tolerance, peaceful coexistence across religious divisions, then then maybe we should think about those very seriously as well. Secularism doesn't have to be the only solution. And today, I think we are at a point, and one of the things where I think Maududi was relatively weak was thinking through the transition. So he articulated an ideal state. We can agree with it, we can disagree with it, but this is how most political theory moves forward, by imagining the ideal state. There is no liberal state because there is an ideal of a liberal state. There is no, there was no fully socialist state because there's an ideal of a socialist state that that people try to move towards. And so in that spirit, Maududi articulated the idea of an Islamic state. But one of the things that he didn't articulate and was really comes to the fore is the political economy of transition from where we are to his ideal state, and the political economy of that ideal state. And I think this is where we certainly today, one of our big, if we look at the world today, if you look at what happened in Bangladesh, for instance, last year, what is going on in Pakistan today, going on in Palestine, going on in America, we are in a moment where it is somewhat open again, as one imperial power, which is America, is being pushed back, is changing. We are moving into a more multipolar world. And the political economy of corporate globalization that we had been living under for the last 30 to 40 years is really shifting as well. And because it is shifting, countries like Bangladesh, countries like Pakistan, who were, and India, who were kind of, who fit into that model in particular ways are today struggling because that model is also shifting. I'm happy to talk about that in questions and answers later on. So I just flagged very quickly new work where I am interested in thinking about, and some of it is published, some of it is in the process, thinking about what kind of concepts do we have from within, South Asian and Islamic traditions that help us move beyond this reliance on the state. When we, for a long time, various kinds of democratic movements have really kind of focused on getting rights from the state, right? Statist rights, that we have more rights of this kind, or we need to have recognition for these rights, etc. But implementing statist rights has proven to be a bigger challenge than most people imagined. And I think we might also then look at existing practices, existing ideas that actually facilitate the distribution of justice in various contexts. So I have looked at, for instance, how refugees and migrants in Pakistan from the tribal areas of Pakistan who were affected by American attacks, Pakistani military attacks, the Taliban in the tribal areas, etc., who then came to urban parts of Pakistan, how were they able to organize their lives? How were they able to claim a space for themselves? How were they able to claim some justice from themselves, not from the state, but from others around them? And the role that the concept of haq plays there. So it's a move, I guess, if I try to connect this with the discussion around divine sovereignty, I think what I'm taking away from this is the emphasis on ethical and social interaction and social engagement. So really engaging not necessarily or focusing not so much on the state, but really thinking about how is it that we can reconfigure social relationships without necessarily relying upon the state. Let me stop here and let me take some questions. Let me stop sharing so that I can see people.